From Apple to Google, plenty of tech news moving the markets this week. To help us sort out the opportunities from the overpriced is the MVP of mobile and internet analysts.
Eugene Munster of Piper Jaffray is with us from Minneapolis this morning. Gene, let's talk right away about the impact that this AT&T purchase of T-Mobile USA is going to have on Apple. Some people say the iPhone is the reason this deal is happening. Whether or not that's the case, how do you think Apple might benefit?
Well, you got to keep in mind about half of Apple's business is iPhone today, so this is really the core of what Apple's doing. And essentially this adds about 3% to Apple's overall business. So for a company that's getting to be $100 billion in revenue and almost impossible to move the needle, this T-Mobile deal has the potential to actually move the needle. And if I was going to put parameters around it, it would be about 3%, which might not sound like a lot, but when you put it in the context of a $100 billion revenue company, it is material.
Let's just do the calculations for everybody, Gene. You're talking about a $3 billion incremental revenue add for Apple because T-Mobile is coming into the AT&T family. Of course, we're all assuming that this deal gets approved.
Right. The deal's got to get approved. That's assuming the deal got approved today. There's obviously technology transfer that has to happen between the two companies. But just to put it into perspective, it basically boils down to adding about 3% to their overall. That assumes that the uptake at T-Mobile is consistent with the uptake at AT&T, with some debate that there are slightly different types of customers between the two that might not be as open to buying an iPhone, but that assumes that you have a similar adoption rate at T-Mobile versus AT&T.
Gina, what if the deal doesn't happen? What if the AT&T T-Mobile USA combination hits too many regulatory hurdles, or AT&T has to let go of too many other parts of its business? Does Apple try to do something else?
Yeah, I mean, eventually they'll probably sign T-Mobile and Sprint for that matter. And so I think it's just a function of time before most or all of the U.S. carriers will be iPhone enabled. Obviously, Verizon's the big story in 2011 related to the iPhone. But if you go out 2012 and beyond, I think you're going to see them continuing to sign multiple carrier dealers in virtually every country.
Well, as we've acknowledged, Gene, we're looking fairly far out here because we know that AT&T deal is going to take perhaps a year to get approved, if not longer than that. Let's look at some of the more immediate issues confronting Apple, specifically the impact of the quake in Japan. I assume that you've done some channel checks and you're very familiar with the Apple supply chain. How long do you think before the quake and its impact begins to affect Apple's ability to supply stores with the iPad 2 and the iPhone?
Well, we think it will start to see it in somewhere between 6 and 12 weeks. If you look at the typical supply of components that the assemblers of Apple's products have in stock, it's about 6 weeks of inventory. So we'll start to see that sometime in the June quarter, probably the months of May, most likely. And given that most of the production now is back up and running, it's probably going to impact a couple weeks. So one way to think about it is this. Today it takes 4 to 5 weeks to get an iPad, assuming nothing changes. Maybe it changes to 6 to 8 weeks or something to that effect for a period of time. And so it's going to have an impact. We're going to see it. It's probably going to be relatively short in nature and will happen sometime in the June quarter.
Gene, have you quantified what the financial impact in terms of revenue may be?
We have. We've looked at it from a demand standpoint in Japan. It takes about 1% out of the overall Apple revenue. As you mentioned earlier, that Adobe was cutting its Japan estimates by a third. If you assume a kind of a similar cut to Apple's estimates relative to their Japan business, it's about 1% to the June quarter, or to the March quarter, and about 3% to the June quarter. As far as the supply side, it's pretty difficult at this point to predict what the impact is to sales. I think it's safe to say this, is people who want Apple products are going to have to wait a little bit longer.
We are back with one of the top tech analysts in the business, Eugene Munster from Piper Jaffray. Still with us here. Gene, thanks for staying with us over that quick break. Prior, we were talking a lot about Apple. One thing we didn't have time to ask you before the break, how many iPad 2s has Apple sold so far? I mean, we know it's early days, but what are you hearing?
Well, our best guess is probably just over 500,000. We talked about 400,000 to 500,000 that opening weekend, and really they haven't had any supply since then, so it's probably just over 500,000. But following this whole iPad 2 release has been one of the more entertaining aspects in almost 10 years that we've covered Apple, and I think that part of the reason is that the demand is just over the top, and really for an evolutionary product, it's had just revolutionary demand. And for example, the lines are about twice as long as what we expected on the opening weekend. Since then, every day we've been calling Apple's stores and asking the store manager how long the lines are before the store opens, and it's been ranging between 50 and 600 in some of the New York stores in the morning for sometimes 5 to 20 iPads. And so this is some pretty comical demand at some level, but I think that even though the numbers might not be that magical million unit number that a lot of people are hoping for just yet, the demand clearly is there to support that.
Gene, before we run out of time, we need to shift gears and talk about Google. The company's $125 billion settlement with publishers and authors was rejected by a judge. My question to you is, now what? They really were hoping to get a read on how people read and use that to improve search results. How much of a blow is this to Google?
Well, I think it's incremental. It definitely is a setback. At the end of the day, Google wants to, their goal is to organize the world's information, and so this is a setback in that sense. And I think it really points to one of the bigger challenges that Google has, which is how they can kind of sustain this 20% plus revenue growth. This is one of the opportunities that they wanted to tap into. They also talk about Android, obviously, and the mobile platform, and video with YouTube. And all these collectively have a lot of promise, but when you have such a big search business, sometimes it's hard for those to move the needle. And so I think that the simple takeaway here is it's a setback for Google, and ultimately is they're pinning a lot of their hopes on growth on Android, which is probably a good place to pin your hopes given the explosive growth in mobile over the next decade.
Gene, I only have time for a yes or no answer. Will Google soften and try to get that digital library passed by softening its stance?
They don't soften very easily if you look at what they've done in China, so I would say no.
Word to the wise. Eugene Munster, thanks so much for joining us, Senior Research Analyst with Piper Jaffray, joining us there from Minneapolis.